Welcome to Discovering Discovery, a podcast in which we discuss the Star Trek series Discovery and talk about how not Star Trek we are finding it. My name is John Quick, and I am joined by...
My name is Megan Washington.
And this is Greg Payton.
And we will be your hosts through this odyssey of whatever the hell they're deciding to put in front of us. I'm not
this
sure.
voyage, you might say.
This discovery.
It could be a discovery. It is certainly not even a voyager that we can go with. So
it's
what?
Something.
So what is this first episode? This pilot episode is a two-parter, which we're combining, I guess, together into this one episode for the podcast. What are the names of our two episodes, Miss Washington?
So the first episode is the Vulcan Hello.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the second episode is Battle at the Binary Stars, which I don't remember there being binary stars in this episode.
There were two stars. Yeah, it's.
Is that what it was said?
I also don't remember anyone saying hello in Vulcan.
Well, Michael.
It's more of an expression, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what was going into that. But yeah, anyway, we'll just dive into the episode, and as of course usual, spoiler warnings.
Spoiler
are ahead. So if you've not watched the pilot, you might want to stop right now.
Or just don't watch it and just listen to what we think about it, and you'll get the exact, a better experience, a more fulfilling experience.
Or better yet, you can watch it on mute and listen to us.
Or that.
Yeah, your options are limitless. Let's get going. Okay, welcome to Discovering Discovery, a show in which we will watch episodes of Star Trek Discovery and then discuss it with our good friend Miss Megan Washington, who is beyond any strength or measure a Trekkie. My name is John Quick. Also with us is Mr. Greg Payton.
Hello. This is Greg Payton.
And our resident Trek expert, Miss Megan Washington. Now, Megan, please establish for everybody your credentials as a Trekkie.
Second generation Trekkie. Thank you very much.
Who was the first generation Trekkie?
My dad. Huge Star Trek fans
so
in our family.
This is a Trekkie, the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he grew up in the era when the original series came out, and it was huge.
Can you list off all of the different series that you have watched from beginning to end?
All of them.
All of them.
Including original series?
So the original series, Enterprise, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, the animated series.
Holy shit, the animated series?
There was the animated series, yeah.
Okay, and all of the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And Enterprise? Did you watch Enterprise?
14 of them, yeah.
Okay.
So to give a bit of scale, I have only seen DS9 from beginning to end. Of course, I have watched many just different episodes of TNG, and a few scattering of mostly the later films, and
the second half of Star Trek 4.
And I have seen some episodes of Voyager, and that is really about it. Greg, yourself?
I never got around to watching the original series in its entirety. I did watch The Next Generation in its entirety. I watched Deep Space Nine in its entirety. I watched Voyager in its entirety. I lost track of Enterprise just because, not so much of the show, but the network kept screwing around with the time slot because it had completely lost faith in the show. So it was just changing the time slot so I couldn't find it. And all of a sudden, hey, it's canceled. No shit. Watched some of the movies, pretty much only the Next Generation movies like First Contact and Generations and Nemesis, which featured a very young, very skinny, bald Tom Hardy, for those who don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the J.J. Abrams, Lens Flaherty Star Trek, and then I still haven't finished the Fast and Furious Star Trek that Justin Lin directed, but I do intend to finish that one. Beyond, yes, Beyond. And then now STD, Star Trek Discovery.
Okay, so then who would you say your captain is?
My captain would have to be Benjamin Sisko. Not only because I share his baldness and his goatee, but because
Were you also born in New Orleans?
I do. I was not born in New Orleans, but I love the city of New Orleans. No, I loved the politics of the show. I loved how dark the show got without forgetting that it was still a Star Trek show. It still remembered what it was. No, I just loved how they had to deal with the interactive politics of being post-war and having to prevent a new war in that show.
Ben Sisko is also my captain. I mean, I would say if I want to go timeline wise, like Picard was the first captain I ever saw.
Yes.
But nothing against Picard, but Benjamin Sisko. If I was going to be captain by any Star Trek captain, it would be Benjamin Sisko. I
still want to see. I still long for a Sisko Picard showdown because Sisko never quite forgave Picard for that Borg shit. As I was like, yeah, bro, you're still around. Like we gotta have words. They never quite got over that. It's very extremely like Facebook status complicated.
And Megan, your captain?
Well, you guys know how I feel about Shatner, so I would have to say Captain Kirk. But
really, I thought it was Picard.
I do love. He's number 2.
I thought he was number 1. Really?
Here's the thing about that.
I thought he was always number 1 for you.
Picard is amazing. Okay, he's fantastic. He was a great captain. He brought a gravitas to the series, you know. But Kirk was like the OG.
Yes, most definitely.
He created the series. Like
most
it
definitely.
Was that relationship, that dynamic that was built there that kind of set the groundwork for everything.
The Kirk and Spock?
The Kirk and Spock.
So is it out of nostalgia or out of like actual commanding of a ship?
Oh, his command was great too. I mean, it's a little bit harder to describe because you guys haven't really watched a whole lot of the original series.
True.
So, I mean, I guess if you're not as familiar with it, it can look a little bit cheesy and you only hear like the kind of trademark stuff like when he was fighting the Gorn and like...
No, not at all. I mean, I loved how they handled... I tend to pick up on many of the pivotal episodes, like the first interracial kiss that behind the scenes, Shatner gets points in my book because he purposefully kept ruining the takes that they demanded he do, and he purposefully messed them up so that they were forced to use the one where he actually is on screen kissing Uhura. I was like, all right, that just gives you points in my book. He's like, fuck it, no, you're gonna use this one. Well, and it's film, so you have no choice.
There's a lot to the character, though. Like, you don't see as much of, like, Kirk was a very contemplative character, and a lot of the stuff that you see now is just like, oh, he's like a, smoking gun kind of like fly by the seat of his pants kind of person, and it's not really who.
Those are just the highlights.
It's just the highlights. Yeah. Like, the captain was way different if you actually watch the show.
Yeah.
Like, he did have moments like that, but he was definitely very, like, introspective and contemplative, and, like...
I do remember that, yeah.
All right, well, so then moving on now to Discovery. Let's just kind of go around and give initial thoughts. We'll start with you, Greg. What was your initial thoughts on the pilot 2-parter?
My initial thoughts were going into it. I went in with it with an open mind. I grew up with Star Trek as a series, not as a movie. So, in my mind, there should never be a time that should go on where there is never a Star Trek show on television. The movies are great, but I've always felt that Star Trek should always be a TV series that you watch weekly to see an idea of an idealized future. So I went in with it with an open mind. Obviously, watching it, this is not the Star Treks that any of us grew up with, or our parents, or the movies at all. I loved the production value and have theories and high hopes for it, but it does take you having to really flush whatever idealized future you had about Star Trek that you knew of out the window.
Yeah, I personally thought it's a really, really well done show, but it is not great Star Trek. That is as nerdy as that sounds, but maybe we can fully dive into that at a certain point. But Megan, what your initial thoughts after seeing this pilot episode for the first time?
Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath.
I mean, I respect the fact that you guys liked it. Even insofar as if we were to consider it not a Star Trek two-parter, the story was weak. Like, none of it really made sense. Like, from any viewpoint of storytelling, I don't think the story was there. I don't think that the characterization was there. There wasn't enough development of, like, relationships between any of the characters. They tried to shove us into a relationship between the captain and the first officer so that, you know, I don't know if we're doing spoilers here, but when the inevitable happens, so that you're supposed to feel something and you feel literally nothing.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so... by the way, this is not spoiler free.
Oh, good. So when she gets murdered.
Yeah, to be clear, y'all, this is a streaming service. All the episodes are either airing or have aired or will air. So,
you don't
deal
feel
with it. It's okay.
There's not enough. They tried to create a relationship there. They tried to build something for you to care about, and there, to me at least, there wasn't anything there for you to care about. Like, Michelle Yeoh was just kind of a glorified red shirt, if you will.
And that's unfortunate because I mean it's Michelle Yeoh. I mean that required, I think, a lot more honor, if you will.
It required a large paycheck, is what it required. A lot of the graphics looked nice.
Money.
They didn't necessarily they didn't look like Star Trek. You know, like, they took out so many things that were iconic to the series. Like, even in the reboots that they did, they still had kind of like
an homage to the original.
Yeah, I mean, they had the view screens, you know, they had the different stations, like the transporter, like everything. Yeah. It was like a modernized version, it was a clean version, it was a redesigned version, but it was still
streamlined, or different.
It still was, you know, true to like what it looked like. I mean, obviously you can't have it look like what it looked like because I was done in the 70s with, you know, 60s and 70s with no budget.
The styrofoam and aluminum foil,
yeah, so you can't, it's not going to look like that.
Right.
But it looked like it was at least part of the same universe. There's very few things about this that looked like it even belonged in the same universe.
Yes.
Broadly speaking.
Yes. Except, I mean, the only thing that seemed to be in line with the original universe was the actual symbol. That's it.
Yeah, they had,
and of course the ship model.
No.
You really don't have to be diplomatic.
So, I mean, I tortured you guys with the timeline here. So this is theoretically like what, 4 years before the Enterprise is built?
Yes, I think theoretically.
They're not going to have that big of a redesign in 4 years. Okay, it looks closer to the NX-01. I think I pulled up like a ship complement size.
And by the NX-01, again, this, I mean,
that would be Scott Bakula's Enterprise is the NX-01.
I'm speaking for, like, obviously the fans know this. Obviously, but the ones who don't know this is like,
the ship from Star Trek Enterprise.
Yeah.
That was the NX-01. I want to say they had like 40 people on it. Kirk's Enterprise, canonically, like in the original series, is said to have like 60 people. I think they retconned it to like 200 people. Okay. I don't know why they did that, but in the show, I want to say it only had like 60 people on it. So this ship should theoretically only have like 50, 60 people on it.
Yeah.
They said something along the lines of it having like 14 decks. I don't know if that was like the minimum number of decks it had, but it's way too big. Like, it doesn't fit. Nobody looked at a picture when they were writing this because it shouldn't have 14 decks. Like, the size doesn't fit. There's a lot of discrepancies as far as like the size of the ship and the complement of the ship, and there's a lot of issues with the warp drive where, like, at one point all of these other Federation ships show up, and they literally show up just to be destroyed. You don't establish, oh look, the rest of the, like, I mean, I think they say like, oh, everybody else is here, but it's like okay, you send off a distress call, you're at the edge of Federation space, like you'd have to go, I mean, it might just be overthinking it, I'm probably overthinking it, but like how many ships are actually in the Federation at this point? Like where are they coming from? Why were so many close by?
Good question.
Like if they're going off to the edge of space where they don't really hang out normally to go and see this thing, how did everybody else get there so quickly?
I guess to give some sort of context, the Battle of Wolf 349 is that the big encounter with the Borg and the battle with the Borg.
Ah, Wolf 359.
Wolf 359. The Battle of Wolf 359. The Federation lost 30 vessels, and that was considered
they got spanked.
Yeah, a major loss at the time. Of course, later on in the Dominion War, they'll lose a lot more. But I think that
but that takes place well over 100 years from now.
Yes.
Yeah, but the other thing about it is after that initial encounter with the Borg, Starfleet stepped up its production of
immensely to prepare
vessels.
For the rematch of the Borg. Basically.
Yeah, but that still takes place 100 years from this point.
Which again, as I'm putting into context, if at one point in the 100 years in the future, losing 30 ships was a major loss, I don't even know how many
contextually, if you want to put it into context, there was later on there's a Klingon settlement that gets protected by like one Federation ship, by the Enterprise C, and that ship gets destroyed protecting the one Klingon settlement, and that act is enough to bridge the gap between the two like groups of people. Like they form an alliance after that one, like that's enough for them to stop like, you know, having like a Cold War and actually get together because one settlement was saved by one ship.
Right.
To put this into context, if that's what we're doing. So the fact that like 20 ships show up out of nowhere, none of which are given names, and they're all just like destroyed and it's never spoken about again.
Right. Well, they quickly, the red shirt quickly names off the ships that show up, like the Jaeger and the such and such and the such and such, and the Admiral ship. It's a very quick name off of the ships.
Do I need to go into the fact that admirals don't actually go on ships in the Star Trek universe? Oh boy,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, we can.
Because we can go into that. That's one of the entire reasons why Captain Kirk was so upset about becoming an admiral, is because they grounded him.
Yeah, normally admirals, are kind of.
That's why when they demoted him back to captain, and everybody was like, "Oh, we got demoted back." Everybody else was secretly like, "Oh, look, they made Kirk a captain again," and it was like a big deal because everybody was really excited about it because he got to go back to doing what he wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean,
like admirals shouldn't even be out in the middle of space.
No,
like,
they're on Earth, like.
Yeah, or on
being
like a star base or something. Yeah. Like they're not going to be. They don't have their like. That's just weird.
No.
All right. Well, let's start off. We'll be breaking down this episode. We start off. It looks like in the void of something, and then there is a Klingon speaking Klingon to the audience, giving them a great speech about how the Klingons need to remain pure.
And this is the entire time, mind you. This is not the Star Trek movies where we go through like a universal translator or zoom into the guy's mouth and you see English. Like it's completely Klingon the entire time.
Yeah. Well, the Klingons aren't reintroduced until Star Trek 3. Mm-hmm. They're not really. That's when they did like the full redesign on the characters. Yes. That's when they came back.
Yes.
So I mean, that's still quite a ways in the future, and you don't really see Klingons from the original series to that point.
No, we don't.
And well, I guess like we can talk about the redesign. What did you think of the redesign on the Klingons this time around?
They look like shit.
I mean,
here's the thing. I mean, the Klingons were redesigned out of necessity, effectively, for when they brought them back. Because
the first time you saw them,
the first time you see them, they're very like, this is the 70s. We have no budget.
They were swarthy space Russians.
And walking the fine line of blackface. They were wearing
glittery tunics. There was one Klingon who was undercover and had undergone surgery to look like a human.
Yes.
And was discovered later on by a Tribble because Tribbles don't like Klingons. There's a whole thing. But they weren't at war with Klingons. They were all chilling on the same space station. Just it wasn't really
drinking beer, having bar fights and shit.
Yeah, having bar fights.
Yeah. So this is our beginning. We have a Klingon that doesn't really look like a Klingon. Like the only real reason that you know that he's a Klingon
is because they tell you he's a Klingon.
Is because they tell you, and he's speaking in Klingon, and is the whole thesis statement of what he's saying is that basically the Federation is a threat. They're insidious, and that we need to beware the people who say we come in peace. So okay, so we have this setup of a Klingon holy war or something is going to be happening
to try and preserve the purity of their species.
And that part you can almost justify. Like they are pretty much a warrior race. Like they raised up and killed their gods. That's kind of their thing. Like to them, suicide isn't a bad thing because you're still effectively like dying in battle.
It's a good death.
It's a solid death. Anyone who's like dying, in a sick bed, it's just not really okay for them.
Right.
So you can see them. It's not the worst plot line for the Klingons to feel threatened by somebody who's going throughout the universe spreading a message of peace and harmony. Like you can understand how that's not necessarily going to sit well with them just because it's so like anti-what their culture and like their aesthetic is.
Yep.
Okay, so we're starting off. The Klingons look off, but they're acting like Klingons.
Yes.
Ish.
Okay, they're acting like Klingons-ish.
Because also too, with the issue is that the main leader of this sect of this group of Klingons is that he's very much a zealot. He's very and because he's a zealot, he's taking many of the philosophies of Klingons to a zenith that is a bit beyond what we've seen thus far from Klingons. So it's definitely like a Klingon who has really drunk in the Kool-Aid and really wants the Federation far the fuck away from them as much as possible.
Possibly doing it as a grab for power is also could theoretically work. I mean, that's not. It wouldn't be considered too out of character for a Klingon to do a power grab like this.
It's not that the concept is out of character. It's that the way it happens is out of character. So for a Klingon, they're very much, they're very militaristic. So for them, instead of trying to rally other ships by speaking to them, he would have just straight up been taking over other ships. He would have beaten them in battle. He would have instilled some of his commanders on their ships who were loyal to him because he was a superior commander. He would have taken over their ships that way. He would have
been fights to the death. Like, wouldn't have been like a straight up like challenge to a fight.
He would have been challenging. He would have been challenging the other ships. Yeah, they wouldn't have been sitting around talking about it because that's just not really how they. That's not exactly how they gain respect. I mean, I guess it could be just my interpretation of it, but that's how he would have amassed his armada, and then he wouldn't have like drawn them to him. He would have gone out into Federation space and he would have started attacking outposts, that kind of thing. That's That's how it would have gone down if you were going to go with more like canonically appropriate Klingons. But them just kind of sitting around having a powwow on him trying to explain to people and being like setting a trap basically is what he did in this episode to bring people to him to be like, oh, look, they're going to try and make peace with us right now. Very threatening.
And that was and
like
that, and I think that's the one that
think about it like that. He's like, look, guys, look, I'm gonna call them over here. I'm gonna trick them into showing up, and then I'm gonna show you that instead of fighting us, they're gonna try and make peace, and you're gonna be like, whoa,
fuck you guys.
They just came over here and tried to make peace with us. Did
fuck
you see them
guys.
coming over here and trying to make peace with us? Like,
fuck
I don't like this.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? That's not how they work.
Okay, we're barely 5 minutes out and already we get like a lot of problems. Okay, so then
we can start with I wasn't really paying attention to the dialogue at that point.
It's then we go to our
there's like the weird albino guy.
Yeah.
Which Vok.
Well, that actually comes in later because after we get this speech from Takuvma, then we go on to this desert planet with Michelle Yeoh's character, and our lead character and our protagonist of the series, Michael Burnham. Michael Burnham.
Played by Sneakwa Martin Green.
I
Google that real quick just so I have that correctly.
All right, and they're on this desert world. And basically, they're talking about how there is a drought, but there's a species here that is intelligent. But of course, they're definitely pre-warped by a lot. But unless
they're basically alien tarantula / cockroaches.
Yeah, and they I mean, they're intelligent enough to be able to like build structures, like very rudimentary structures, but their well is run dry. They're not going to get any rainfall unless they do something. These people are going to die, and then so Captain Michelle Yao and
Shaniqua Martin Green. That is the commander, Shaniqua Martin Green, who played Michael Burnham.
Yeah, are going to roll up, and they're going to basically shoot open this well, and so they get picked up from the alien from the alien bug person world, and then they proceed to go off to investigate one of their like listening posts or one of their sensors.
Now, if we can pause.
Okay.
General Order 1. No identification of self or mission. No interference with the social development of said planet. No references to space or the fact that there are other worlds or civilizations.
That's the prime directive.
That's General Order 1.
Okay.
So basically,
yes,
they pop down to this planet which is naturally just dying out because no water in the one well on the entire planet, where all of the citizens of the planet get water from the one well, the only well.
Yes.
So they go down and like pop open this well, just cruise up plain as you like. The only bipedal humanoids cruising around,
who are observed by the actual creatures who live on this planet.
Yeah, because they're not really doing all that much to hide themselves.
No. And then they just whip out a phaser, shoot the well, and create water. And then peace out. The captain and the first officer. And this is our introduction to the world of Star Trek. You're like, oh, this is what the science vessels do. They go around essentially fucking with other planets. And then peace out.
Yes.
Yeah, with no mention of the
prime directive. Are you saying that that's not correct?
Yes.
By how much?
If memory serves, I believe there is a few episodes at least where they observe societies remotely, and then just they're like, all right, well, that's it for them.
Yeah, and watch them die.
The Vulcans were watching Earth for years and just didn't mess with it because it was too primitive. Okay, humanity was blowing itself up for, years and generations, and the Vulcans never touched it because that's
not touching it.
That's just not how they do. So theoretically, the Federation, is built off of those kind of principles. There's other like cultures and planets that they went to visit who did have space travel, but who hadn't, broken Warp 5 yet, who weren't allowed to join the Federation because they hadn't reached that touchstone in their technology. So they knew that other people were out there. They knew that that technology existed, but because they hadn't reached that point, they weren't allowed to, become part of it because they weren't going to cheat them to that point. They had to figure it out on their own. So the idea that they're just coming down to this like weird primitive planet, just all willy-nilly kind of haphazard and creating water, it just doesn't fit.
And they do, the captain does give a theory. She gives a theory that they need to give the planet a chance to survive, given that the resources were always there. So it's not like they're
right.
So when you're watching
it's not
like
the resources weren't.
It wasn't. Yeah, it's not like they were bringing water. The water was already there, but it's just their involvement sort of changed things.
It's the fact that whatever they accomplished by going there, they could have done from like orbit. It's just like, okay, precision phaser fire.
There's a lot of stuff like that. So true. I mean, one of the feature films that like Data was on a planet for, years watching, like observing a civilization. They had a cloaked kind of science center there where they were just observing the civilization. There's multitudes of examples of them just observing civilizations, even in the reboot movies. And the third one, when they go down to the planet and they move the civilization so they don't get destroyed by the volcano, they do it in such a way where they're attempting to not be seen. They fail miserably, of course, but like the attempt was there.
They were trying, whereas in this they're blatantly not.
Yeah.
And they basically leave. It's just all right.
We could spend an hour talking about the first 5 minutes of this and how it just doesn't fit.
Well, let's move on to them. So they go. Let's move on to them murdering the Klingons. So they go out.
Right. So they go out. They're cruising around for no reason near the edge of Federation space near the Klingon Empire.
Find out what happened to their array.
because they have a random array out there, which is totally, that's fine. You know, going to, and then they say that they find a ship that looks like it went through the array, which the ship, by the way, is way bigger than the hole in the array, but their sensors can't they have a starship which goes greater than warp 5, and they can't determine whether or not the array was shot or whether or not something went through it.
So they have to use a telescope to see what happened to it.
So they have to use a telescope to see what happened to it. They don't have probes. They don't send anyone out to actually examine the array. The first thing they do is look out into what looks something like vaguely like an asteroid field of some kind, and decide to send out the first officer to go and examine the ship that the sensors can't read because of the interference of the minefield. So, I mean, if we want to talk about the fact that this is a science vessel and they're just kind of jumping ahead way too many steps in the investigation, we could talk about that. But instead, we're going to talk about the fact that the first officer decides to cruise out, not using a shuttlecraft, just kind of defying the laws of physics in her spacesuit, and lands on the ship, which wakes up, and then there's a Klingon fellow inside who comes out and
attacks her.
She tries to say hello.
Yep. He attacks her.
He whips out his batleth. It plants it on the ground.
No. Before he plants it on the ground, some bitch swings that shit at her head.
It appears as though he swings it at her. We don't know for sure because the editing was shitty.
And he misses because
he's a terrible Klingon and therefore
deserves to die.
Deserves to die.
So
we're just gonna leave
it was a death by mercy.
Death by mercy. So anyway, he plants his batleth on the ground, which why he's even got a batleth in space. Anyway,
which can't move very fast because it's space.
A batleth which is not sharp. It's more like a weirdly shaped baton because there's no blade on it.
Yeah.
Plants it in the ground, and then she football tackles him. And for some reason, his batleth was pointed backwards with the blade towards him.
This was a poorly trained Klingon. This is poorly trained.
He was a bad Klingon.
Like,
so the blade, which was weirdly planted, pointing towards him, impales him. He dies instantly and floats off. Her satisfied with murder, pieces out back to the Enterprise.
Satisfied with self-defense.
Well,
had no choice.
The Shinjo. This is not the Enterprise. This is the Shinjo.
Right, the Shinjo.
Mind you, it's a show called Discovery, but we're establishing that she is the commander of the Shinjo. So watch the show. You'll see it.
Yeah, it's not until episode 3 that you actually get to the Discovery.
Which is weird.
Okay.
Because so much of the Star Trek TV shows are focused around the ship.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like overall, the show definitely went out of its way to really break with the bonds. I don't think it's Voyager all over again, but I do think they went out of their way to break with the bonds of Star Trek.
The thing is that they're actively trying to not be the thing
that started them off.
That they're there for.
Yeah.
And it's kind of it's like the issue that they're. Like the J.J. Abrams issue with the Star Trek movie reboot and that kind of thing is that people think they're too cool for Star Trek, if that makes sense. It's not like the cool thing because it's a bunch of pacifists cruising around doing science and, spreading harmony and peace and love and utopia around the universe effectively. And that's not, nobody wants, people want to run around blowing stuff up and they want to run around like being space cowboys, and it's not generally considered exciting, I guess you could say. So that's why when they did the reboot, they're like, oh no, it's going to be exciting and there's explosions and there's, they just kind of changed the vibe of it so much, which you're like, okay, like there's a certain amount of change where it's updated and acceptable and you're like, sure, there's been some action stuff in Star Trek, but essentially what it always comes back to is it comes down to like the argument and like the the utopia and the people trying to strive for that.
For a better world. For a better tomorrow. That was it was always about a better tomorrow.
Exactly.
No matter where you are in space.
So this, on the other hand, doesn't even have that. Like the newer movies still kind of have that thing. They're still kind of struggling for that. And they, especially like the third one that they've done, it's still kind of all over the place, but it's kind of starting to recenter on that message. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't have that message anywhere in it. There's one guy who knows what's up, and he gets insta-killed.
Well, first, I mean, jumping ahead, and that's good. All right, straight up, the Shinjo gets attacked. Klingons like, fuck you guys, attack. the I don't know, instant commander or whatever gets face blown up.
First off, the thing that we're the thing that we're skipping over is okay, so Klingon dies. Yeah. They send Michael gets back to the Shenzhou. Mm-hmm. They're like kind of repairing her. Then out on the Klingon vessel, T'Kuvma's like, okay, our torchlighter's dead. We need a new guy. Somebody gonna step forward. And then there's this albino who's of
no cast, no crew, no family, just some bitch ass nobody.
Yeah, he's Vok, son of none.
Did they really explain that? Because you can't really disown. I mean, you can disown people, but it doesn't really work that way because you're very much tied to your family, and that's where like the honor and everything comes from. So, did they explain it all? How he's son of no one?
No, they never really went into the fact that he's just obviously he's not the product of some immaculate conception, unless he is, and they'll change that too. But they never went into his birth and his parents. So, yeah.
But Vok volunteers to apparently to light the beacon of Kahless,
which is what exactly?
Kahless was one of the Klingon gods. He was the god of.
Well, he was basically the founder of Klingon civilization. He wasn't the god. He was the he was basically like the person that is responsible for Klingons being Klingons.
There you go.
He united all of the Klingons together, from what I can remember, and for that he's called Kahless the Unforgettable. And let's just remember that because later on that's going to come back in a big bad way. So Vok volunteers to do this. Michael ends up back on the bridge, let everybody know, hey yo, these all are Klingons, and then
Kahless is the spiritual leader of the Klingons.
Yeah, and then boom, like bright light shining through. They can't even filter it. And then Michael goes back in to have a little private conversation with her foster father. And
who is who?
Who's her foster father, Megan?
I don't want to talk about that.
No, you do.
Here's the thing.
Okay.
Hint. She shares the daddy of another Vulcan who is supremely famous.
So theoretically, this girl is Spock's foster sister because he would have been about 5 at this point in time. I want to say like he was about 5 and she was like 11 when they found her.
Based on the prime timeline.
Based on the prime timeline, which is what they're saying that this is a part of.
Ooh.
Maybe. It's not been designated as being like the alternate timeline, so we're going with the fact that they're considering it prime timeline.
They have said that it is set within the prime timeline.
Yeah. Ooh. So then, theoretically, she's Spock's
adopted sister.
Kind of like his foster sister, which, I mean, we could go into all sorts of issues there as to why, a human child from a human settlement was taken in by Vulcans and not returned to Earth. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could talk about that.
And also, too, why Spock never.
Well, no, we talked about that. We can re-talk about it again. But Spock has a mysterious brother that he never talked about, and you don't really
know that. They don't know that.
They don't know that, but it's not
It's not uncommon.
It's not unusual for Spock to basically
hide shit. It's like nah.
It's feasible for there to have been somebody else chilling that just never got spoken about.
Yes.
Especially if it was this crazy bitch, because she's a little bit out there, so I would have been embarrassed and I wouldn't have spoken about her.
But also, I mean, to talk about Michael Burnham, she is apparently the first human to attend the Vulcan Science Academy, which that doesn't. Does that work?
No.
But also the first human. But also the first human raised Vulcan to not attend Starfleet.
And somehow be a commander on a Starfleet vessel.
Now, mind you, they never said she did not go to Starfleet. We just never saw her go to Starfleet.
No, they said that she goes to Starfleet. It's like a throwaway somewhere in there.
Ah.
Like after she comes back, after Sarek brings her over to the ship whose name I can't remember.
Shenzhou.
The Shenzhou. After Sarek brings her over to the Shenzhou, you would think take her back to Earth, drop her off in San Francisco, and then she goes to the Starfleet Academy as some kind of junior ambassador. And then apparently, the bug was bit when she was on the Shenzhou, and she decides to try and work her way back. But it's never said that she spends any time on any other ship, which is in itself weird, unless unless we're talking about there's just that few ships in the fleet at the time, which is like fine, but you wouldn't think that they would allow someone to come up. Starfleet, it's based off of kind of like a naval setting. So when somebody gets they move up in rank, traditionally they move them to another ship or another location, because then they're no longer around peers who knew them at a lower rank. So it's, you bring somebody in at a higher rank to a new group of people, because then they only know them at that higher rank, and they're not going to have the same kind of issues that you would have as somebody who knew you as like a corporal when now you're a commander. Mm-hmm. So there's not going to have that like familiarity there, and there's not going to be that kind of like
contempt.
Weird. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So theoretically, she would have been moved around to a couple different ships, which they said she wasn't, because the Shinjo is the only ship she's been on. Which is why
bizarre. Yeah.
It's very bizarre, and that's why they say that she has such a strong relationship with the captain, is because she's, one of the first members of Starfleet that she met, and she's just been with her for, you would think, or like 5 to 10 years.
But you would also think that at some point you have to go to Starfleet. You have to be trained.
Well, no, she would have gone to Starfleet and then come directly to the Shinjo.
Yeah.
And you can, go through, but she would have started off as an ensign, so she would have been an ensign, right. And then she would have been,
Yeah, moved up from there, exactly. Well, but
commander, lieutenant commander, and worked her way up.
But then, so Michael gets some advice from Sarek as to how to handle the Klingons. So she goes back.
Sarek, who is oddly human.
I guess didn't quite notice that, but I'm not as familiar with Sarek as you. Mm-hmm. So she goes back onto the bridge. That was a weird way to say that. So she
basically walks out of the transporter room and onto the bridge. They're on the same floor. This decked ship with minimum 200 people.
The stage,
which, if you look at it size-wise, was vaguely bigger than the NX-01, which had like 5 decks.
The staging was odd. The staging was definitely how geographically people get places can get a bit convenient because of how things are cut to.
But she gets the information that she needs from Sarek. She goes back onto the bridge. She tells the captain that, hey, what we need to do is we need to fire first onto the Klingons. And the captain refuses to do that because of Starfleet.
Now, you failed to mention that this is after she jumped out of the regeneration chamber.
Okay.
Basically, which is where she was. Mm-hmm. Runs naked down the hallway.
Whoa,
gets kicked back.
No, she's not naked. She's not naked.
She's in like a house coat.
Yeah. She's wearing,
she gets kicked back so they can finish regenerating her. She comes back on the bridge, gets in an argument with the captain about whether or not they should blow up the Klingons, who at this point, she shouldn't even know that the Klingons are there, because the last thing she saw was she got in a fight with this guy, right?
The weak Klingon.
The weak Klingon. So she shouldn't really know at this point that there are other Klingons there. So that's another hole in the story. Like when she wakes up in sickbay, like she has no idea how the situation's escalated.
Well, the only thing that she knows is there's the one Klingon vessel, and then all of a sudden the 24 other Klingon vessels show up, which is supposed to be from the representatives of the 24 great houses of the Klingon Empire.
Yeah, but that doesn't happen that happens while she's like out.
No, that does not happen while she's out. That happens after she wakes up.
After she wakes up, but she had no reason to run to the bridge because that hadn't happened yet.
That hadn't happened yet.
As far as she knows, there's the one ship. They're not technically at war with the Klingons. There's no reason for her to be under the impression that it's an emergency for her to run to the bridge.
At this point,
there's a lot of holes in the story at this point.
At this point in the story, she's jumping to the conclusion that if there's one of them out there, there's more. Yeah. And as a result, we have to respond.
Which makes sense, as they're next to Klingon space, so you would think that there's going to be a lot of Klingon ships there.
Yes. And so the other 24 houses show up, and they start talking with Takuvma, who manages to tell them that, basically going on to what you had said, which is like
he talks to them and convinces them via words to have a holy war,
which doesn't really work for Klingons.
No.
Also too, the conversation as a whole. I mean, yes. Once again, it's plot driven, but not so much character driven, because the Klingons see Starfleet as these, I guess you could say, imperialists who threaten their individuality. But the problem is, the Klingons posit them as being the enemy, being the bad guy. but we never see from their perspective how Starfleet is the bad guy. We never quite see what they've done to deserve the ire of the Klingons.
Yeah, there's no setup for any of this. Which, I mean, if, it is prime timeline, then there isn't any setup from, like, where we're starting to where we are now. The other thing that we could talk about is, like, the weird mind meld time whammy cell phone trick they've got going on, which makes no sense.
Which I think we'll get to that, because like it's right after this that the rest of Starfleet kind of shows up.
And by this point, Michael Burnham has been put to the brig for basically trying to commit a damn mutiny.
No. She completely does. She mutinies.
She does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she questions the chain of command, questions the authority of her captain. Her captain takes her off to the side to kind of talk her down, at which point she attacks the captain, commits mutiny, tries to take over the ship and attack. Yeah. Michelle Yeoh comes back because she's a badass and just like gives her the what for.
You got to give a lot, because we haven't talked about Doug Jones's character of Saru. And Saru is apparently the only one that when she comes back on board, he's just like, what the fuck's happening?
Yeah, and so that's another thing. Like, his character and the setup of his character, it seems interesting. Like, there's not really a lot of focus on it, but, from any other perspective or any other series, he would have been a bigger focus. Like, 'cause he's an interesting character. He comes from an interesting planet.
But to be fair, that's the one thing that, because I felt the same way until I saw episode 3. Episode 3 does a really interesting job of, flashing forward in time, and the lens definitely focuses on what happens to all these characters after what Burnham has done. But again, that's the focus is not squarely on them in 1 and 2 just yet. It's really
but I mean, this is like a 2-parter. This is a setup for everything. You don't know that there's going to be a massive time jump later. Right. That all these people are going to be in different places. We don't know if we're going to see any of them again.
It was entirely made, it not so much the way the original Star Trek series were made. It was made in the thinking of we're doing this totally cable series style, like completely serialized.
Yeah, and that's another kind of issue with it too. Is that this is, I mean, I guess you can't say it's really an issue, but this is one of the first Star Trek series that's not been completely, there's not been the standalone episodes. Like, everything else had kind of a carryover story, and this one seems to be more like a traditional cable show where it's just like week to week it's going to be a continuation of the same story and the same kind of plot.
Yeah.
Which is weird. I mean,
it's very different. It's very different.
It's very different, and it can be done, properly, but it it feels weird at this point. There's not been enough setup. It's not even suffering from a traditional, plot, like pilot syndrome, where there's too much exposition. There's too much.
Yeah.
Because there's very little exposition.
Yeah, it's very much handled like a cable drama, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, we get no setup. We get no view of the world. We get nothing outside of, their ship. There's not really any other view at the rest of the Federation. Like, if you're taking somebody who had never seen any Star Trek before and you put this down in front of them, they would have no clue what the fuck's going on.
And so then after Michael Burnham gets thrown to the brig, and the Takuma Klingon is like, "See, I told you they would come to us and be like, hey, we cool bros, and we got to show them that we ain't." Basically the war starts. The Klingons start shooting. The Federation starts shooting back, and then we get Michael Burnham down in the brig, and then our red shirt comes in, which I do think that this was the writers of the show kind of giving a middle finger to the
the original philosophy of Gene Roddenberry.
Yeah, no, it totally was. Can you what were your thoughts on that scene of a head injury guy basically talking clearer than
hang on, let's back up 1 second, because what's hilarious is that Michelle Yeoh's captain literally asked the guy ship status right before his console blows up in his face. Like, status, ship is hurt, so is he. Like, it was just, the timing of it was just almost comical.
So his console blows up. He's one of the ensigns on the bridge, right? And so he's going to sick bay, which is weird in and of itself because they're in battle, and I guess his console's blown up, so they don't have anyone to relieve them. But with 200 people on the ship, you'd think there'd be another ensign who went up there to take over for him or something.
Yeah.
So he's been relieved, and he's going off to sick bay.
And he seems very concussed, like he's really just.
And they are giving off like the indication that he's concussed. So he winds up in the brig, strangely enough, instead of going to medical.
Yeah.
The thing about this definitely does feel kind of like a slap in the face to anyone who is a fan of Star Trek, because this scene, he basically comes in and he expresses a lot of confusion as to what's happening. He basically lays out, hang on a minute, we're a science vessel, we're not a military, we're not warriors.
But he also explains the philosophy of Star Trek.
He explains like the core philosophy of Star Trek very simply, very eloquently, and then she looks at him and she goes, "You've obviously hit your head. What are you doing here?"
Get to sickbay.
and then the brig blows up and he gets sucked out into space.
Yeah. So
this is essentially them looking at every single Star Trek fan who's like, "What are you doing? This is supposed to be like, they're scientists. This is supposed to be, people striving towards a utopia. Like, they don't even use money. Like,
yeah. And to that,
looking at those people and being like,
sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what we're doing here anymore. Bye."
Yeah.
And that's basically what the scene is. That's what the scene feels like.
And so from there's basically more attacks happening. Michael Burnham manages to make it out of the brig to go up to the bridge, but not before the admiral shows up in his ship, tries to negotiate more with the Klingons for, I guess, reasons at this point, and then Takuma shows off his cloaked ship by ramming it into the admiral's ship.
And we're not going to speak about physics at all, so we're just going to drop that one right there.
Okay.
About what would actually be needed for someone to ram into a ship in space.
I guess the other thing to talk about is, like, so at this point in history, the Klingons would have cloaking technology, but it's kind of presented as, hey guys, here is the only Klingon ship with a cloaking device.
Right, which is weird because they had cloaking devices, like all of them did at this point. If we're going with Prime timeline, then he wasn't the first one to have a cloaking device.
Or the only, yeah.
No, or the only one.
Which that's what it's presented as.
That's what it's presented as, but that's completely inaccurate.
So that happens. Michael ends up on the bridge. And
so you're forgetting the fact that she ends up on the bridge because she apparently punks the computer and convinces one of the world's smartest AIs
using Vulcan logic,
using the world's worst logic, which is not even sound logic, to release her. And then she jumps through space, doesn't freeze to death, doesn't have any kind of injuries, doesn't have her eyes explode from the pressure, nothing.
She gets frostbite. She gets frostbite.
Does not get frostbite.
But what they show us is that's the extent of what happens to her. She gets frostbite.
She gets a couple ice crystals.
Yeah.
It's not even actual frostbite. So she leaps through space after convincing the computer to set her free from the brig for committing mutiny and effectively attacking the captain. Runs to the bridge, and
And in this moment, Saru and the captain are deciding, it's like, okay, well, we have photon torpedoes, but we don't have a delivery system. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put the warheads onto a transport, and then the captain is going to fly the transport with armed warheads straight into
on a suicide mission
at the Klingon ship.
Now, because of Takuma and his whole, again, he's drinking the Kool-Aid, total idealist, taking his crusade to its zenith. He's going to retrieve all of the dead Klingons who have died in this first interaction with Starfleet, this first combat situation with Starfleet in a while, and he's going to personally prepare their bodies for the afterlife, which in this storyline is literally being put in a coffin and lining the outer hull of the ship to say, here are our dead bodies, and
We could go into Klingon burial rituals here because that's not really how they did
right,
things.
Which
I mean,
right. So he does
there's
that.
No screaming. There's literally no screaming to send off their spirits, like at all, which is weird.
Right.
Like, there was a weird prayer that happened, but he didn't pop his eyes open. He didn't scream to send him off when he died, and there's no Klingons are fans of opera, but this wasn't exactly opera.
Right. And then the captain decides, all right, well, since this fucker is like taking bodies up there back to his ship, just put the warhead on one of the bodies, and that's all she wrote. The warhead goes into the ship, they detonate it, and basically lop off the front end of the ship.
Yeah, well, just to note, this is part of an overall bigger plan. Because all right, so in a moment of actual clarity, Michael Burnham says that okay, if we kill this guy, we make him a martyr, but if we dishonor him by capturing him, all of this falls apart because he has managed to unite the 24 houses through means, I guess.
Through talking.
So here's the thing. I can't remember the last
verbiage,
time
that's it.
They were all united, but sure, one speech and let's go for it. Yeah. Like, sure.
And through one act of Starfleet showing up saying, hey, we bring peace, fuck them. What?
Yeah, seems legit.
It's like, all right, so we're going to engage in war because they brought peace. All right.
Not to mention his fancy tractor beam, which can suck up bodies but not debris.
Yeah, it's the future, ladies
because
and gentlemen.
Fuck science.
So, yeah, that's more or less they decide to booby trap a body so that it would disable the ship, and then the captain and Michael are transported onto the ship to capture T'Kuvma. T'Kuvma ends up killing the captain, and then...
Which, can we retcon again for a second?
Yes.
So they put the photon torpedo on a body, which then gets pulled into the ship via tractor beam, and then they beam aboard the ship.
Yep.
Yes.
After the explosion goes off. Like the explosion goes off, then they beam aboard while it's like disarray.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Did they pause to examine the structural integrity of the ship before beaming aboard?
No. Like, fuck it. We're going on board to get to Kuvma to fucking get to get a hostage.
Question.
Which fails.
Yeah,
by
yes.
the way.
Their sensors weren't able to penetrate the Klingon ship, right?
Right.
Yes.
So they have no idea of the structure of the Klingon ship.
Also
That's
correct.
True.
Which means that they technically could not beam aboard the Klingon ship because they wouldn't know if they were beaming into a wall or not.
Arguably.
I'm just gonna leave that there.
Okay. Well, we're gonna swing right past that to apparently to so Michael and the captain end up on the ship.
Just the two of them.
Captain gets speared in chest with Batleth.
They're okay with blowing.
Mechlith. That's right.
She gets stabbed with the Mechlith, and then Michael, instead of stunning T'Kuvma
and take him as a hostage, which was the plan.
Which was her plan.
She instead switches it
to
consciously
kill mode.
To kill. It wasn't like
phaser set to kill.
It was
from
like
stun to kill.
Yeah, like it wasn't like the phaser was set initially at kill, and she would have had to have changed it to stun. No. It had been on stun the whole time, so she had to. So instead of this, like, if it was already set at kill and she just had an emotional reaction, I could have understood that. But the thing was set in stun, so she had to go, that motherfucker.
Kill.
Yes.
It's like, oh, bitch, gotta die. Wait, so, but you know. The whole notion.
There's no hesitation there. There's no build up
absurd.
to the fact that there might be hesitation there. As a matter of fact, the only thing that surprised me is the fact that she beamed onto the ship without her phaser set on kill, based on how the character was delivered in the first two parts of this.
Yeah, and that's been frustrating. It was frustrating as the fact that they're trying to posit this character as someone who is impulsive and is a Vulcan in all the worst ways. And I guess
she doesn't exhibit any Vulcan tendencies whatsoever.
It's frustrating because she's obviously suffered the loss of her family, but you know, and all of her actions speak to that. But in a very haphazard way.
Like Worf's family was killed in the Kittimer massacre.
Exactly.
You know, and he doesn't like the Kardashians, but does he still follow orders? Yeah. there's so many instances of people who had similar, backgrounds that relied
Sisko's
on their training, relied on,
except for his son. I mean, his wife was killed on his starship, and you don't see Sisko going out taking a shuttle or taking the Defiant saying, "Go fuck up Picard now." It's like he didn't do that.
No,
like,
and
how far is it to Borg space?
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. He doesn't take the entirety of Deep Space Nine and turn on the thrusters and cruise it on over.
Or Betty had turned Deep Space Nine into like a spinning top on a collision course with the Enterprise.
It just doesn't happen because there's character development and there's actual characters who are struggling morally with what happened.
With duty versus
there's none of that here.
Personal issues.
There's none of that here. Yeah. There's no indication that she even cares about anything like that because she's been shown as a loose cannon even in the flashbacks of her.
A good buddy of mine who's far greater knowledge of this canon than I am always said that the earlier iterations of the show were meant to show that space is dangerous. I think that was even the premise of Enterprise. But Enterprise was different in the sense that it was the first ship to actually make it out of Starfleet.
They were the first ship to leave the solar system.
Right.
They went on. There was, surprisingly enough, a Klingon crash lands onto Earth, and they are taking him back to Kono, to the Klingon homeworld, and they had to kind of fight for that right because the Vulcans didn't think they were ready. So basically it's this Klingon who's in a comatose state and they're taking him back, and their thing is that they have to wake him up before they get back there because they can't show up with a comatose Klingon because that's going to be
a problem.
It's going to be embarrassing. It's not it's not a good thing to show up with a Klingon in coma. That's not going to make anybody happy.
It's like, did you put him in the coma?
What the fuck? No, but
it's no way. It's no way for them to die. You know.
I say all that to say that at that point it was positing that space was a dangerous place, and that's what we're following.
It's a dangerous place. They didn't. The Vulcans didn't consider them ready at that point.
Right, but now, however many decades after Enterprise that we're looking at.
Not that many.
How many was it?
It's like 40 years. I want to say.
So 40 years. Is space still that dangerous? Because I feel like that would be the only way to really explain why things are so impulsive. That's they are literally shooting at the hip in every which way once the action gets going.
Well, either way you run it, she is officially court-martialed, and she is sentenced to life in prison, which I don't know why I find this weird, but it always just seemed like at least, but this is in the 100 years in the future, when the Federation hands out prison sentences, they always seem to be
it's like 100 years later.
Yeah, significantly lighter. It's just oh yeah, you get 2 years in prison, and everyone's just like, oh my God, that's so long.
So 100 years later, I would have thought space to be not as dangerous as this. But, I could be wrong. But overall, I guess, and even though, again, even though I liked what they were trying to do and like what they were positing, loved the production value, loved how much money they poured into this thing.
Anything's going to look good if you throw money at it.
Right. But I feel like they definitely did go out of their way to betray the notion of what Star Trek was supposed to represent.
It was very purposefully done.
Yeah, so I felt like you could have done a notion of, yes, you have this idealized world, but there are prices you have to pay to keep this idealized world, and that could have been
a far more interesting story.
Yeah, that could have been your through point to say, listen, like in Deep Space Nine, they actually had Section 31 explaining, listen, you don't have this utopia by accident. We've had to kill a lot of people to get us this far.
Which, speaking along those lines, we'll go into kind of a next segment. We'll just call this Discovering Philosophy. So just based upon the general philosophy of what both the Starfleet and the Federation are supposed to stand for, how is Discovery measuring up so far?
Badly.
What are some the key points that you are seeing that they're just basically just I guess flaunting or just flat out ignoring what like kind of the central thesis of Star Trek is kind of really supposed to be about.
It's not. It's definitely not even ignoring. There's definitely flaunting the fact that they're being like the anti-Star Trek. It's being very different. But like the message is different. I mean, there's, in the mockery of the characters that are representing, what the
core beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple characters who do kind of try and bring that in, and they're summarily dismissed. They're brushed aside.
Two of them, like both the ensign and Michelle Yeoh's captain, are both trying to uphold the core values of Starfleet, and they are both summarily killed, somewhat unceremoniously.
Yeah.
You could also say that Doug Jones's character, in many ways, and he's presented as cowardly and weak.
Yeah, that too. And I mean, he's on the ship when she's first brought aboard, when she's fresh out of the Vulcan Science Academy in theory.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to be holding the same position, so he doesn't seem to have gone very far in his career between the 2 points in time. I mean, it's viable for Michelle Yeoh to have still been the captain, 5-6 years later, however long it took her to get. But even then, it's the 5 years to get through 4 or 5 years to get to the academy, and then it's got to be her working her way up in the ranks. And so his character having been in the same position, for at least, 10 years?
Yeah, I'd say close to that. And
then for her to outrank.
And then to outrank him. Like, there's so many different little things that, that's kind of humiliating in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are certain, basic things, like there is a manual about rank and how you get to that rank. There is a process as to how you get there. And I felt like the show sort of went out of its way to, kind of just cut around it to get to the action, to get to the point.
Yeah.
And to get to the
There's
plot.
A lot of shortcuts. I don't think anyone nobody sat down and did the math on any of these things, or somebody did and nobody else cared. Because there's a lot of jumping around. There's a lot of we're not going to worry about that.
I really kind of think it's kind of that second one of just they didn't really care.
Well, and if you look at the development of the series, there was a lot of people who started on it who actually were people who worked on Star Trek with Star Trek, who are familiar with the property. And over time, as development went on, all of those people washed their hands of it and walked away. And you can very much see that. Like, there's little kind of bits of it everywhere where it was, people who actually knew kind of what was going on, and you can see very much where they were written out.
Yeah, there's definitely those moments within. I mean, it really stopped feeling like it felt like a kind of a cool sci-fi show, but not like a great.
Definitely not a Star Trek show. I mean, it could be a sci-fi show. You could change a couple of the names, and it could be any sci-fi show.
And ultimately, I feel like if they're positing the notion, and I'm always trying to think about, ways to get inside the minds of the people that have to do this kind of like backbreaking work and hours with CGI and what have you, that if the pendulum were to swing so far left that it's so far divergent from a Star Trek series, that the only way that it can swing right would be if, in fact, it either was the beginning, the origins of Section 31, that the pendulum swings right, and that everyone who was involved with this incident, which is, hard to cover up, like you said.
It's a huge incident, though.
Yeah, it's a huge galactic incident.
If it was one Klingon vessel versus one Starfleet ship, then that would be something completely different. But there's a minimum of 50 ships here.
And the only way to clean that up would be to have this massive cover-up, to try and push us back toward those Starfleet ideals and those Roddenberry ideals. But at this point, I'd be curious to know
how would they do. There's a few thousand people here, and they lost an admiral.
Yeah, how would they do that?
There's no way to cover this up.
And what would it take for that to happen? What would it take for that to swing back?
The fact of the matter is, at the end of this episode, the Federation is an open war with the Klingon Empire. Like,
true. It's not like a secret war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is like, I don't think this fits into any kind of like.
It doesn't fit anywhere into the canon.
Yeah.
And then they bring her back and they've got her in like the court, and Starfleet courts have always been very like bright and open like the rest of the series, and it's a very shadowy kind of like a shadow government she's been dealing with here. You know, like there's 3 people, you don't see any faces. The lighting's weird.
And what do you think?
Like, it's ominous.
Do you think this was really Starfleet?
I mean, that's what they're painting it as.
I mean, yeah, it is very strange because I mean, Deep Space Nine was essentially supposed to be the anti Star Trek. I mean,
and it had a very different vibe to it, and that was something that people definitely noticed, was that it did have such a different kind of aura to it, but at its core it still had the same fundamental values.
But it was about questioning those values, like holding those values up to a light, not disregarding those values.
Exactly.
And basically, Deep Space Nine was a Star Trek show that asked the question, at its core, it asked the question, to get to the utopia that we have, how much did it cost? And what happens when the bill comes due? That's what it was.
And this show doesn't even seem to be doing that. It's less of an examination of those values and more of, well, if I'd almost hate to say this because it's definitely done better, but in a lot of ways you can almost take a look at it as like the Transformers movies to the actual Transformers show. It's like it's definitely looks good. There's big explosions, but it's like the heart is missing of like what was always supposed to be about. They Michael fucking Bay'd it, basically.
But I feel like Michael Bay is better storytelling.
You're a better person than me. I just really wonder, and to be clear, I do intend on watching the entirety of it just to kind of see where are you going? Where are you going with this season? You know, they've just gotten to season 2, so they're obviously doubling down on this to either, continue the same story or create a new story or a new arc. But I want to see where they go and where they take this, not just story-wise, but also because of the cast. Like I want to see where they end up with Sonequa Martin Green's character. I want to see with the guy from Rent. He plays one of the science officers once she actually gets the Discovery. Jason Isaacs. I want to see where he ends up. I really want to see where it ends. And
I'm curious how they take someone who's been responsible for the deaths of so many people and bring them up to the point where they're having their own ship in a relatively short span of time.
And they reveal that.
I'm curious to see what kind of retcon happens. Because
it's not really a retcon. They actually in the next episode, they actually go in directly.
I feel like it's going to be a stretch. Yeah. And either they're looking for a scapegoat, but there's no way, at least in the actual like Star Trek universe, where this would be okay. I mean, the lengths that Kirk has to go to clear his name. It took like 3 movies for Kirk to clear his name.
Or even just
and they're gonna do it for her in an episode.
And even the consequences of Picard. I mean, he still had lots of PTSD and damage from being a Borg. I mean, it carried on.
Well, and
not
he was
just
captured, and like
the
stigma, stigma that follows him in the series and in the movies after that.
Yeah. I mean,
it's something that he's constantly dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, what happened to him, which was no fault of his own, is the reason why Picard never ends up becoming Admiral in that timeline. I mean, at this point, in his last movie, Janeway ends up becoming Admiral before he does because of what happened with him and the Borg.
Yeah, I mean, everybody else, there's very real consequences for the things that happen to them.
Yeah.
And it's the way they've truncated the timeline on this. For whatever reason, they're just kind of fast forwarding around, paying very little heed to, set up and development, because they just kind of wanted to rush right into, whatever story they're trying to tell. And I mean, yeah, you could just plop in with her getting the ship, and then this is a story that unfolds over time, and we find out about this, one ship that goes up against a Klingon ship, and it's this like hidden massacre that nobody hears about. And if that was something that came out over time and backstory, that would be far more compelling and far more, and this is her like after she's come back from being this like angry young person, and she's like leveled out at this point. Like, there's so many different ways you could tell a version of this story where it's going to be way more interesting and it's going to have way more merit, and they're just not doing any of that.
I really think in the future episodes you're gonna hate the hell out of Jason Isaacs' captain.
I've heard that.
But also too, I think as a whole, and this is not exclusive to Star Trek Discovery, but I feel like as a whole, from a pop culture sense, many of the things that we grew up with and we're used to and that have been a part of established science fiction and history and what have you are changing because people who are in charge of them are purposefully flying in the face to change them.
Well, there's the dark universe push right now.
Yeah, for whatever reason. Everyone's pushing for darker things. Yeah.
Yeah, an example of that is like the Mummy movies. Like those were great movies. They're a lot of fun, and there was a comedy to them. And they decided to do this dark universe reboot of the Mummy, and it was awful, and nobody wanted to see it because
Rule 1 behind making a franchise: earn it.
And I mean, there's any number of movies where they've done that. Like it's the Dark Knight and like all the Batman reboot movies. And yeah, Batman's always been on the darker side of things, but there's also been a comedy element to a lot of the Batman universe. I mean, and so you're having this like extremely dark canon. You're like, okay, so we're doing like dark versions of everything now, and eventually people are going to be sick of dark versions of everything, and you're going to want to go back to like an optimistic version of everything. And I think this is just kind of like the last nail in the head of this like kind of dark universe thing that people are trying to do.
The grim dark.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know. I could agree. I could agree with that. Although I will say like the Dark Knight movies worked not necessarily because of like a darkness to Batman. There was like a grounding.
I was just gonna say that's why they worked. They worked because they were grounded. That trilogy worked because it was grounded.
At the time it wasn't played out. Like when it came out, it was very much a different take on it.
Yeah. Well, that, and you also like. I mean, it's also one of those things of like if you want to have a hero that has a grand set of villains, there's really nobody better than Batman. Like he's got the best like in all of comics, he's got the best rogues gallery. And we're getting totally off topic.
So
I think this is
trust me. Yeah. I trust me. You're preaching to the converted. But I don't know. I think with Star Trek, I feel like just like in Star Wars, there are certain things that you don't have to alter because it's all there in the universe. Just like how. Again, going back to Deep Space Nine, going back to the Next Generation, there were always consequences that took the show to dark places.
Well, there is, and even at the end of Next Generation, like there's even consequences for the warp drives. At the very end of the series, they realize that they've essentially been tearing the universe apart with the warp drives all this time, and that's like the one thing that they've been pushing people towards. Like that's their beacon of civilization is getting the warp drives to a certain extent, and they realize that they've been destroying the universe this whole time with the warp engines, and so there's
breaking space every time they went to warp.
Yeah, so there's very, very real consequences at the end of everything, where it puts so much into perspective. So that's it's all balanced, and this doesn't have anything like that.
Yeah, it's a concern because it's like you can't have dark without light.
No, and you have to have that to to highlight the good things. And so far in this, like anything that's been, good or even remotely like a beacon of light in this show, they've just murdered.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Well, I think that'll wrap it up for this first episode. So we'll come back again next time with episode 2. And I think Greg and I kind of know what you're in for, and
not excited at all.
Yeah, you really. I don't know how well that's gonna go for you. But until next time, this was Discovering Discovery. We'll see you all on the next planet.
Live long and prosper. That's all I have to say. Live long and prosper.
And I'll think of a sign off in the meantime.